Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for attending our diversity luncheon. We are going to begin our panel. Today we're going to be discussing the current programs and history of diversity and social equity in the cannabis industry. My name is Larissa Bolivar. I have been in the cannabis space for almost 20 years now, which is like 100 years in cannabis dog years. I run a nonprofit called the Cannabis Consumers Coalition, and we are a consumer watchdog organization. We helped with the pesticide issue here in Colorado, which subsequently helped pass the medical marijuana testing bill. I was one of the folks who added PTSD onto the medical marijuana registry. I have a long history in Colorado fighting for patient and consumer rights. And I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. I obtained my master's degree from Regis University, where I wrote my master's thesis, which was Enduring Racial Disparity After Cannabis Legalization. Before I go on to my presentation, I want to introduce here, we have Jason Moore from the City's Attorney's Office. He'll be here to answer any legal questions that you guys may have. We have Ashley Kilroy, who's the Executive Director of the Denver Department of Excise and Licenses. Greg Weiner, he's the Assistant to the City Administrator, Special Active Permits, Activity Permits Division for the City of Oakland in California. And Kat Packer, who is the Executive Director for the Department of Cannabis Regulation in the City of Los Angeles. Thank you guys for being here today. So I wanted to frame our conversation with providing some data for you guys. This is not intended to be a negative or a disparaging type of presentation. This is just to present the hard facts of what we're working with today. As we know, the drug war was targeted drug war. There are more people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses that are people of color than white people. However, arrest or use data shows that white people predominantly use cannabis more, so there's not really much of a correlation between use and arrest. And then in cities that have legalized cannabis, black men are 9 times more likely to still get arrested for possession. So we do have some enduring issues regarding race and disparity in the cannabis legalization effort, and we're here to discuss ways that we can fix that. So current ownership data shows that the disparity is still pretty high. You have over 80% of owners that are white. I picked this quote right here from Michelle Alexander because I feel like it just really paints the picture on how much of an issue this is. We have people who are in prison that could possibly be in there for life, and yet we have people who are making millions of dollars in cannabis, and that disparity needs to be fixed. There are a lot of reasons why minorities aren't participating in the industry. What we do know pretty much is, the suitability requirements, they're pretty high. It's really resource intensive to get into the cannabis industry. If you want to start a marijuana dispensary, you're looking at a minimum capital raise of $250,000. If you want to start a cultivation, you're looking upwards $1 to $2 million, if not more. And then the suitability requirements added to the capital requirements. If you've had a marijuana conviction in Colorado, for example, you can't get a license for 10 years, whereas places like California have waived that. And that's keeping people from coming into the industry. When I wrote my thesis, the biggest thing I found was fear. And the fear is being justified by the first slide that I showed, where the arrest disparities are still continuing. You've got cultures and communities who have been persecuted for years in the drug war. Why do they want to put themselves on a radar to be persecuted even further? And so, addressing that fear, will be opening up programs that are more educational, in addition to training, and opening up the doors to those opportunities. Also right here, it just doesn't make sense to be going after people of color for marijuana, considering that most of the people that they arrest aren't even kingpins. We're talking about low-hanging fruit. So it's just, in my opinion, completely unfair that these folks aren't able to participate in the industry for something that is pretty much a minor infraction, if not completely decriminalized now. So as we move forward, in my thesis, and this is something that I've been seeing around the country, These are different policy recommendations and initiatives that various municipalities and states have been working towards. There's social equity programs that we have, for example, in California and Massachusetts, where they're allocating a percentage of licenses to minorities and providing priority processing for these folks that qualify. To qualify, you would have to live, for example, in a zip code that has been targeted in the drug war. So, places in LA is a really good example. Everybody's heard of South Central, which is, been popularized in media, but really, it's been a major drug-riddled area. There's been talk about affirmative action programs. California is another example of this. States are actively expunging and sealing records of cannabis convictions to enable these folks to be able to overcome the suitability issues to participate in the industry. There is training programs. I know in California that's a big issue. One of the issues with, you can't just give money to someone and expect them to run a business. You have to ensure that they're going to succeed. And so in order to have a successful social equity program, you're going to have successful training programs and incubator programs to help these businesses grow and thrive. Another thing that we were just talking about, another possibility would be using revenue to create business grants and loans for minorities interested in participating in cannabis, and perhaps working with businesses to start incubator programs to ensure success. And so I broke down right now what we have currently in the national landscape. We have Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida. They require diversity plans for their applications. These are merited applications, so those that have the more robust diversity plan that's actionable, so they're already taking measures. For example, there's a National Diversity Council. People can join that, and that gives you training programs to help you create diversity and inclusion programs within your organization. It's not, these diversity plans aren't, hey, I wish that I could create a diversity program. No, it's like, what are you going to do? What are you doing, and how are you going to implement it, and how much of your budget is going towards that? And that's how they grade that. There's states with social equity and diversity programs that are very forward-thinking. I think California has the most advanced program. Massachusetts has an advanced program, but it hasn't really been utilized. Ohio has a diversity program or social equity program. In Florida, which that only emerged because of a lawsuit. They required farmers to have or applicants that have like 40 years experience in farming and agricultural experience, which is, shut out a lot of people from applying, but it predominantly shut out black farmers, and they sued. And so now they've allowed for a couple licenses to go to those folks. Nevada and Illinois, what they do is they have a merited application process, and then if you meet those points and those guidelines, then diversity is a tiebreaker. So it's not necessarily a forethought, it's an afterthought. And then here, that's why we're here today, is to have the conversation of what we're going to be doing in Denver. And then Colorado recently went through a sunset review. So in Colorado, our marijuana regulations sunset every 4 years, and we review them, figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked, and make suggestions from there. And so we've made some suggestions, including having incubator programs, also reducing the 5-year and 10-year limitations on criminal offenses and not being able to participate in the industry to 3 years. We would like to see records expunged, and we can push for these things legislatively, but we have seen the issue and are definitely actively working towards amending that, and I'll let Ashley go into further detail about that. But what I want to do is I want to start the conversation with these folks in Oakland and LA, Kat and Greg, because I want to hear, and I want y'all to hear, what they've been doing, what they've implemented, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and if there are any suggestions that you would have for us here locally. Kat, if you would like to.
Sure. So one, I just want to say thank you to the City of Denver and the Denver Marijuana Management Symposium for having this conversation. I don't think it's appropriate to bring regulators into a space to figure out all of the other complexities that exist with cannabis and not hold space for social equity and the intersection of social justice in cannabis policies. Want folks to know that I personally have a deep commitment to social equity. It's a priority of mine within my role as executive director, similar to how Larissa had shared that Michelle Alexander quote. Michelle Alexander is who brought me into kind of understanding the ramifications of social justice and cannabis policy. I had mentioned the other day when we were on our morning panel the need for folks to try and move away from using the term black market. And part of the conversation that we'll have today is really going to discuss, why that may be an offensive term. If you, scroll back to those slides where we're talking about how communities of color have been disproportionately affected, and we recognize that the folks who were criminalized and families who were, torn apart for decades, it's primarily because they were black and brown, not because they were consuming or possessing cannabis. People across the board were consuming and possessing cannabis, but it was because they were black and brown that these folks were being arrested. So to understand that we're still using the term black to mean illicit, understanding this history really isn't fair. And so I'll make the ask again. As you all, go out into your spaces of professional work, let's try to, when we get here next year, hear that term less. The other thing that I'll mention is that it truly is important for there to be intentional decision-making early on for communities of color and low-income and minority communities to have access to this industry. Because still, even in the state of California, where it seems as though we have really robust, at least a robust conversation about social equity, sometimes the only difference between conducting legitimate commercial cannabis activity and that is criminal is having a license or working for someone who has a license. So if we move forward and communities of color and low-income communities don't get access to licensure or can't work for someone who has a license, they will continue to be criminalized even as we have supposedly legalized cannabis. The other thing that I want to mention is that, just like licensing and regulation, social equity is not an event, it is a process. It is not a kind of static conversation that you can have and walk away from. It is something that has to be a fluid conversation and something that needs to be constantly analyzed. We started that conversation in the city of Los Angeles largely because of leadership that came out of the city of Oakland, and now there are many jurisdictions, or no, I don't want to say many, that's not true. There are about 4 or 5 jurisdictions that have social equity programs, and they are very much a work in progress. Just like we passed laws and regulations that we're still trying to implement, we've passed a program that we're still trying to implement. And our program in the city of Los Angeles is intended to give one, priority processing, and then secondarily, other types of technical assistance to business operators. If you think it's difficult to operate a regular business and the success rates of regular businesses, diving into the cannabis industry can sound kind of crazy. And so to the extent that we are able to, as a licensing and regulatory body, help folks navigate this system, I think that that's part of what we want to do. I'm going to pass it to Gray to talk about the specifics of implementing a social equity program, because to be honest, we're still kind of in the thralls of what that looks like. But I think it's going to be important, an important part of this social equity conversation and folks having access to licensure is going to require a real consideration of what it means to grandfather pre-existing businesses. And I don't know that this has been a part of the conversation thus far. And this isn't to kind of slam jurisdictions that have grandfathered pre-existing businesses. We have done the same. But I think it's important to kind of acknowledge what that means when we do so. when the city of Oakland conducted its social equity analysis, one of the things that it acknowledged, and I appreciated that it acknowledged, was that, most of the businesses that were being grandfathered were largely those who were run by white males and who had been able to escape criminal enforcement for years, while across the street, black and brown bodies were simply possessing cannabis and were being arrested. And so it could almost be kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to grandfather these businesses who were kind of, either flagrantly or even in a underground sense, engaging in cannabis business, and the advantage that we give to these folks who were able to escape prosecution for years, and then to have a conversation about social equity. So I didn't pose a solution. I just kind of wanted to share a reality, and it's something that folks need to consider as these conversations are happening, because when we do so, when we grandfather these businesses, we are preserving the status quo of largely white male communities who had been able to escape prosecution for much higher and elevated activities, in a sense. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Greg to share about what the implementation of Oakland's program has been.
Thank you. And thank you for the City of Denver for having this panel and for this entire event. So I like to steal a quote from a former colleague that I think kind of frames how Oakland arrived at its equity program. And the quote is that organizations move in the directions of the questions they ask. And so around 2015, 2016, the City of Oakland, in anticipation of state law changing, was looking at regulating the full supply chain. Historically, we regulated just the retail, but for various reasons, we were never able to regulate the supply chain. And the central question that basically our elected officials raised was, who is it that's benefiting from legalization? Who's going to benefit in the end of the day? Why is it basically white males end up getting permits in the end? What really was helpful in terms of recommendations, something I would emphasize, and what I think finally got us over the hump, because we had discussions for several years. We passed an ordinance in 2016 that we never implemented. What actually got us over the hump was doing a formal analysis. I guess you could say a disparity analysis. We called it a race and equity analysis. Happy to send the link out. It's only our analysis was only 10 pages, but it was key in the sense for a couple of reasons. Number one, we got our elected officials to actually agree upon a goal, so we could hold them to that later, of having a more equitable industry, more wealth building opportunities for people of color. Secondly, we framed the analysis with data in terms of law enforcement, activity with respect to cannabis, poverty, employment, and it's extremely important, in my opinion, to have this foundation in place, because when you jump to the solutions, a lot of people, first off, you're going to be changing the status quo. It's not going to be convenient for people that have the head start. And so we spent a lot of time in 2016, going back and forth with different proposals. Hey, this group doesn't like it because this is inconvenient for them or what have you. But once we actually had the data out there, it changed the entire discussion. We had the goal in place, and people couldn't ignore the realities in terms of where we were. And then from there, once we had the goal, it was actually pretty simple. We laid out, well, what are the barriers to achieving that goal, and then what are the ways of overcoming those barriers? So some of the barriers are pretty obvious. Some of them have been alluded to already. In terms of a head start for established operators, you're not dealing with a level playing field, most likely, wherever you are. There's probably some degree of cannabis activity in your jurisdiction, and some people are probably in a more beneficial position than others. Access to capital. I was on another panel a couple weeks ago. Someone jokingly said, it's helpful to have capital when you're operating in capitalism. Obviously. That goes for any business, right? But in the cannabis space, you can't get a formal bank loan. And so those that already have a leg up, their odds are exponentially increased. And we have like a famous example. Supposedly one of our dispensaries that's very successful now, they were able to ask mom and dad for a loan, take out a second mortgage to help them get started. And so if you have that private network of wealth, you're going to be, just like in any industry, but here even more so, at a head start. Access to real estate is very much tied into that. Cannabis criminal record, fees in terms of application and permit fees, these are all barriers. And lack of familiarity with red tape or just distrust of government has been discussed. And some of these barriers are explicitly created by government, like the fees, but some of these barriers, like access to capital and wealth, you know, we at the local level or what have you, we didn't create this problem, but we can exacerbate or reinforce these barriers by how we choose to structure the licensing. So, so here are some of the strategies that we laid out in terms of how to address it. So, number one, in terms to address the Head Start, we realized we had to have some sort of phasing of permitting. If we were to just open the floodgates, especially even though there was a broad under commitment to let's reinvest some of the cannabis tax revenue for small businesses loans for equity applicants, but a little bit of money a year from now is not gonna be all that helpful if the Head Start is even furthered by the fact that we open up the permitting to anyone. So we came up with essentially a program where until we collected that new cannabis tax revenue to implement a no-interest loan program, which we just launched yesterday, finally, we said that half of all permits across all different types have to go to businesses or individuals we categorize as equity applicants. And if you're a non-equity applicant, but you help them by providing free space for 3 years to operate their business and security, we refer to them as incubators, they get permitting priority as well. So that was an attempt to address the Head Start issue, the access to capital. And then when it came to issuing of dispensary permits, which we limit the number of those, historically the city of Oakland had required that someone had to have a physical location as a prerequisite to qualify. And so who can afford to sit on to lease or purchase a property where you may not even have a certainty that you can operate that business, and in some cases this can take months or years. So we strategically tried to lower the barriers of entry in the sense of allowing equity applicants to fill out an application that tested their business savviness, but then if they submitted a complete application, they're eligible for a public drawing. And so once they were 4 applicants were selected from that, basically investors and capital followed. And so one of the first equity dispensaries that was selected earlier this year is going to open up. I love their name because the guy's last name is Blunt. You can't make it up. And he's partnering with someone whose last name is Moore, M-O-O-R-E. So it's going to be Blunts and Moore, right across from the Oakland Coliseum.
Awesome.
So, and then in terms of our own barriers, we equity applicants are exempt from city licensing fees. In terms of criteria, you have to be an Oakland resident, you can't exceed 80% of the average median income, and then you basically either have to have a cannabis conviction that arose out of Oakland or have resided in certain police beats for 10 of the last 20 years that had disproportionately higher level of cannabis activity. And finally, we have, to address the distrust of government and all the complexity with cannabis law and red tape, we have a consultant providing technical assistance to try to address those issues. So that's hopefully a helpful outline of sort of our program.
Oh, that's really great. It sounds like you guys have a really well thought out and well-oiled program. Congratulations. So Ashley, we come to you, and I have a bunch of questions for you.
Okay. Okay. Hello.
Not to put you on the hot seat.
Okay.
So let's see if I can even see these because I need my glasses. So Ashley, when and why did Denver decide to explore equity programs?
Thank you, Larissa, for that question. Listening to you guys really sort of makes me think back and thinking about what you were talking about, our cannabis dog years. So when we started in 2014, and as you just said, what your program looks like is based on what the questions you're asking. The questions we were asking were, how the heck are we going to do this? And if you remember when legalization first passed in Washington and in Colorado, our Governor Hickenlooper came out and said, don't open the Cheetos and something or others just yet. Goldfish, this isn't going to fly. Don't do it. And so we were all kind of not even sure if it was going to work. And then our governor of Colorado and the governor of Washington sent a letter to Obama, which is what actually prompted the Cole Memorandum, where the Cole Memorandum said that states that have legalized markets and have strict rules and robust enforcement would be a lower priority, enforcement priority for the feds. So those were the questions we were asking. And then we got the Cole Memo, and we worked on developing our rules and regulations in response to the Cole Memorandum and making sure that we were taking action to protect marijuana from getting into the hands of youth, and to make sure we were protecting, putting rules in place so that there wouldn't be growing marijuana on federal lands, or that organized crime couldn't be involved. So those questions we were asking is what guided our program. And absolutely, we were not thinking of equity at the time. When my team first got started, one of the first things we did, January 2nd through however long it took us, about a month, we interviewed about 100 people all over the city about what we should be doing, what we should be thinking about, including Black and brown people, including our Mayor's Office of Economic Development, and thinking about what should we be doing. One of the first things we heard back at those early days is our Colorado Chambers of Commerce weren't even going to allow marijuana businesses to be a member of a Chamber of Commerce. Our Office of Economic Development, when I asked him, what are your thoughts around this? They said, we will not be engaging in this space. We will not be providing small business loans because we're afraid our federal funding will be taken. They were saying things like, we don't even know what's going to happen. Why would we even engage in something like this if we don't know if it's going to be profitable and we don't know if it's going to shut down? So that's kind of where we were. That wasn't on our radar. So I'll kind of stop with that, since that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very exciting to be a part of this historical movement here in Denver on this next step. So with all that said, who should be at the table when cities are starting to think about equity programs?
So what we've been doing since then, our mayor has always directed all of our city agencies to look at everything that we do through a social equity lens. So that's around our, Office of Health Equity that the Department of Environmental Health is going to be standing up, where we're making sure where we have our parks are going, what we're doing with public safety issues. So looking through everything with a social justice lens. With that, from the beginning, sort of intuitively maybe, without even thinking about equity, we have taken marijuana tax dollars and directed that to low and moderate income neighborhoods. We've done that through using marijuana tax dollars for capital improvements. We have done that with, right now we've just increased the sales tax on retail marijuana, an additional 2% for that money to go to a new affordable housing fund. And we think that'll be about $10 million next year. So we've got the tax issue first. Then Mayor Hancock last year directed us to move forward with affirmatively, from the city's standpoint, vacate or expunge marijuana misdemeanor convictions for conduct that was illegal at the time and is now legal. So we're moving through that piece. And then we've put together an equity governance group. So the people we have at our table are Office of Economic Development, because we also want to know, as we're looking at some equity programs, what's the future of this market? Where is this going? What type of investments do we want to make? And in what sectors? We have the Office of Economic Development at the table. We have our Department of Human Rights and Community Partnerships. We have someone from the mayor's office who specifically deals with minority contracting. We have Jason Moore, who is a city attorney who specializes in this area. We have our chief economist, and then Bia and a couple of others of us.
Excellent. So, and is this open to other community members who want to make suggestions or participate?
Absolutely. Right now, our equity governance group, we're dividing out into groups, and the city attorneys are running and working with the DAs on the conviction piece. We're working on other areas. I attended an expungement event this weekend with some members of the community, and we're talking about how and when BNI can engage with them to find out what they're looking for, and then bring them into our conversation.
Oh, awesome. Okay. And then, let's see, I really need my glasses. What is Denver's vision when it comes to marijuana equity?
Well, I really liked what Kat just said about a work in progress, and that this is an ongoing conversation. I think it's to continue to work through our plan, our equity governance plan that's broken out into a bunch of different pieces. I think right now for us, the fastest, quickest thing we can move on is the convictions. With regard to looking at workforce development or ownership, we are having our chief economist is working on doing a study that Jason has worked with him on and told him what kind of information we should be looking at in that study. That's, we all have the data related to the arrest disparity, but then also looking at the makeup of the industry, and then looking at what are the opportunities and market conditions for the industry going into the future.
And also comparing it probably to other industries like we were talking about before.
Oh, yeah,
and the
yeah.
distribution and disparities that exist in those industries as well.
Yeah,
and how we match up.
One thing we've talked about too is if we're going to set aside some money to assist small businesses, do we want to limit it to the marijuana industry, or do we want to have people engage in other industries if they're interested? Our Office of Economic Development generally takes sort of more of a holistic approach to economic development, rather than sort of industry specific, and look at where the need is in the community. Right now, we know in Denver we have a lot of construction going on with the I-70 corridor and some construction stuff at DIA, and we're short on on construction workers. So our Mayor's Office of Economic Development has a program right now to provide training subsidies for people who want to learn a field in construction so they could work in that industry. So Jason and I and the rest of the team are still working through what it will really look like, but the mayor has directed us to move with urgency, so we are trying to move really quickly and get all the information we need.
Okay. And last question, and then you're off the hot seat. From the experiences so far, what are the challenges you have seen and will need to overcome, and what are the lessons learned?
I think challenges are, well, maybe first of all, just being first out of the gate and just trying to make sure the sky didn't fall and figuring out where we are. And now I think the challenges are working with Jason, making sure we have the data to justify a position and make sure we do it within the legal parameters. And Jason, I can turn it over to you if you'd like to comment on any of that.
Sure. Kind of reading some of the materials on other programs, it didn't appear to be any specific legal paradigm for licensing programs, or especially for cannabis. So I just kind of took the direct route and looked at equity programs in other industries, affirmative action programs in other industries, and sort of copy that model, because the lawyer's job is to sort of foresee the worst case scenario, and worst case scenario would be you have a full-fledged program and then it's sued out of existence. So what I told the group is the best thing to do is just sort of protect the program as much as possible by getting all the data possible. So that's what the Office of Economic Development is working on now. I think what will happen is that the program will be kind of modeled after the data. So whatever the data shows, that's what the program is going to look like. I can't imagine that Denver's data is going to look differently than anybody else's data, but we certainly want to have that nailed down before we roll anything out.
I have a question regarding data collection. In Colorado, we aren't able to grab numbers on identifying information on whether, just on names, owners, race. So we don't really have a baseline to start from. Are they going to make that information available?
Well, that's what the study will do. And I think, right, we can't get it from our licensing data because we haven't asked that question. as I understand, the state might have asked it for a period of time, but wasn't consistent with asking it, so their data is not, appropriate since it's incomplete. So I think probably what we would do is what some of these other studies have done, is it'll be based on self-reporting, contacting a sample of business owners and employees and ask them those types of questions.
Okay. And maybe perhaps this is something for you, Jason, and any of y'all can opine, but there's a lot of talk about lawsuits against these programs. I know in California people were claiming that it was unconstitutional. Colorado, we have 2 constitutions that are guiding, or 2 amendments that are guiding our marijuana program here. Have you thought about those possibilities and what would be ways to mitigate? I'm sure a lot of people that are here representing other municipalities would probably be concerned about the same type of scenario.
Yeah, that was the purpose of chasing down the affirmative action route, is that very reason that, we want to avoid creating a program that is susceptible to challenge, or at least susceptible to easy challenge. And there's a lot of case law on a lot of affirmative action programs, so that's a broad field, and then sort of pulling that in and applying it to cannabis, I think it'll be a lot of work, but there's a model out there, so it could be done.
Yeah, and I think that, and I mentioned, threats of litigation during our morning panel yesterday, and I think that we're always receiving threats of litigation, and to the extent that what we're doing is extremely valuable, and essentially, we could be creating barriers for folks who wouldn't qualify, and folks would be unhappy with that. I think that what we've tried to do is to, one, because of Prop 209 in the state of California, we're unable to use race specifically as a determining criteria for the program. So folks will often ask, is the program for black and brown folks? Is it for minority community members? And the answer is no. Our program is based on a number of criteria, some of which Oakland is using as well, being low income, coming from a disproportionately impacted community, having a past nonviolent cannabis conviction. But as we were doing our own analysis, and if folks can go to cannabis.lacity.org, we also have our social equity analysis. It's a little bit longer than your 10-page. We have a 150-page analysis, but decades and decades of disproportionate arrests. But I think that we'd argue that we have a rational basis for creating a program specifically to promote legitimate economic opportunity for folks who meet these criteria. And that analysis provides us that nexus and that rational basis.
Okay, great. So we are now heading towards the last quarter of the hour, and do you guys have anything else you want to add before I open up for questions?
Just on that topic, it's probably, that sounds like City of Denver's on the right track, and I'm curious to see what you guys develop and what programs, affirmative action programs have been found defensible. But in general, I presume like incentive-based programs are probably more defendable than restrictions. So, giving loans using tax revenue is probably less subject to challenge than half of all permits have to go to X, Y, Z. But I also think there's something to actually making your program more, functional for those that. I think our incubator program kind of opened the door to those that don't meet the equity criteria for them to get their permit as well. So I think that also has been part of the reason why we haven't faced legal challenge thus far.
I think the incubator program is a great idea. I think it helps incentivize businesses, and that will maybe curtail the urge to litigate.
And the last thing that I wanted to add before we shift is that I do think that while equity conversations thus far have focused on licensing, I do think that it's going to be important to broaden the scope of what that means, kind of similar to what Ashley was discussing. We need to have a conversation about health equity. It's going to be important that low-income and minority communities don't see significant health disparities because of cannabis legalization. We're going to have to continue to talk about enforcement disparities and enforcement equity. It makes no sense for us to move in this direction and then peel back the data and see that, you know, these community members are now being targeted for things like public consumption or other types of criminal penalties. And I do think that you're right. We don't just want folks going into the cannabis industry. Folks need economic opportunities generally. So to the extent that there is intention put behind creating non-cannabis economic opportunities, I think that communities are generally supportive of those efforts as well.
And it's an easy way to enter the industry. The ancillary market is massive. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. And people with existing skill sets, technology, marketing, accounting, can transition into cannabis. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a licensed cannabis business. And we have to make sure we're educating folks that there's an easier path to get involved in the industry that would also be less resource intensive. All right, well, thank you guys. I want to open up the floor to questions. Anybody has questions? Okay, we have one over here.
Thanks. I do. I'm going to echo something that Ashley said. In Colorado, when we began this whole legalization process, we didn't start with adult use. We started with medical. And I always say that I was the head of the Department of Revenue at that time, so had to get my arms around it. I always say we started with about 2,000 businesses in the whole, because we were, although the statutes were enacted in 2010, they went into effect in July. Existing operators were allowed to continue to operate pending licensure as long as they applied by August 1st. So we had to address that backlog of individuals who were already operating and were needing to be licensed. And anyone who had not applied by August 1st of 2010 was essentially not going to be allowed to be a part of that operating business grandfathering. And I use the grandfathering term a little bit differently than what you did. So with that, and then fast forward, then we did get all of those businesses licensed, and then fast forward to 2014 when we had to license those businesses for adult use. And had 12 months to do it, from election to open doors. So one of the things I'm going to recommend is, regardless of what kind of a program you put in, make sure that you have enough time and enough money to implement it, because that's one of the things you're going to consider. And I would agree as well. I wanted to look at that organizations move generally in the direction of the questions they ask. We didn't really ask a lot of questions. We were given a lot of answers. License these businesses, put up a program, make sure you're doing it right, and we just rolled up our shirt sleeves and did it. So the question I guess I'm going to ask you all, I needed to give you this background, is because when you have a lot of states have an existing unregulated medical market, and you may or may not have been given the mandate to bring them into the regulated scheme or not. But assuming you have, then how do you overlay a social equity program when you know you have this number of businesses that are going to have to be the priority? And many, they may or may not be in communities of color. So that's one of the questions I want to ask, was regardless of your, your viewpoint, and I think it's a great one, and I think we should have social equity, especially because in the communities of of communities of color, they've been disproportionately disadvantaged. But I'm trying to look at the particulars around how do you practically do that.
And I'll admit it's not easy, right? No, not yet. Give me some time, I'll figure it all out. But I think that part of it depends on what the scale of the program and what the scale of your licensing system is going to be. Let's talk in hypothetical numbers. If you know that you're only going to have a total of 5,000 licenses that are going to be issued, and you're grandfathering or trying to transition 4,000 operators, then you only have space for 1,000 more. So I guess part of what I would recommend, and we're not necessarily doing this in the city of Los Angeles, so sometimes I'll make recommendations that we're not quite doing, but that's, neither here nor there. I don't think that you exempt those folks from promoting equity. One of the things that could have been done, which I think is being done with tax revenue, is, okay, well, everyone's gonna pay taxes, and then the tax revenue can go into a fund to fund social equity. Now those businesses that were pre-existing are supporting social equity in a sense. Maybe, and we work kind of through these difficult challenges every day, but maybe you later on create a program where you promote supplier diversity. So if you have a bunch of retail operators, you incentivize those retail, I know, it's his idea, but I said it first, so now everyone thinks it's mine.
I'm used to it.
Yeah, I take all of his stuff and then, but you promote supplier diversity and you say, okay, well, we have, 500 retailers and we have these social equity applicants who are producing and manufacturing, and we're gonna incentivize you. If you have 20% of the products on your shelf come from these folks, will give you a tax credit of some sort. I think that there are ways, it doesn't have to be, folks don't have to feel as though to serve one community, you're completely creating disadvantages for other folks. I think that we have existing folks in the city of Los Angeles who have been grandfathered, who are interested in promoting social equity. They recognize it as this industry's corporate social responsibility. And so these are some of the ways that I think that things can be managed at the same time, but it's difficult. We're trying to transition operators at the same time that we're trying to create this social equity program. And to be honest, part of the challenge that we're experiencing right now is that we have folks who want a social equity program, but it's difficult to have a social equity program when you don't have a licensing program, because what are you priority processing for what? If there's no infrastructure for the license, I can't prioritize giving you that license. I can't give you technical assistance for something you don't have. So I do think that there's an order of operations, but it helps when the questions are being asked on the front end so that you can at least have perspective to try and phase in what a solution looks like.
I would just add real quick. I think it's a very serious issue to deal with in Oakland. The scale is so small. We only had 8 permitted dispensaries before. It's not as significant as so there were hundreds and hundreds of people in the supply chain, but because they had no permits, they had no rights to be grandfathered in. So we had perhaps more of an opportunity to shape the industry. But I think basically incentive-based programs for those that kind of are grandfathered in, like Kat alluded to, maybe license fee or tax reductions if they do X, Y, Z, whether that's buying product from folks you want to be successful, or having them provide free space for a certain period of time. So I think we haven't done a good job of that, engaging with the existing businesses and with the equity program, but maybe that's something, thanks to a state bill that passed recently that's going to set aside a chunk of funds for local equity programs. I think we're part of that. We're going to try to use those funds to offer more incentives.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Hi, I have 2 questions, one for Greg and Kat. The first one is for Greg about the incubator. We just established that the majority of the industry is composed of white men that had this investment opportunity from the start. Why and how could the cities incentivize those people to incubate what is going to be their people that are going to go for the same market as them? So that's the first question. And the second question, in Denver, from everything that we've studied so far, what I see is a lot of, and I think Larissa can back me up on that, due to zoning laws, a lot of those businesses are already in industrial parts of town that are were more impacted by the war on drugs. So if we create more licenses, aren't those licenses going to be placed on those same communities that we're already trying to protect? And how is Oakland and LA trying to make sure that if we have more licenses and if we have equity licenses, those licenses do not create a bigger impact on communities that we're already trying to protect?
I think those are really good questions. So in terms of, I think it sometimes doesn't make sense for the same business type to incubate the same business type, but incubated delivery, because that's your competition. Some folks do that. It probably makes more sense to incubate a different business type, and you might have some symbiotic opportunities. So a general applicant cultivates, and they're incubating an equity delivery or distribution business that moves their product. So in that way, they're not competition, but they're actually kind of potentially working together. And then in terms of land use, so cannabis, maybe in everyone's jurisdiction, but I know for Oakland, just like anything, we're not starting from scratch. So if the zoning code is inequitable to start with, and we have most of the industrial areas where we're saying we're going to put these businesses, have lots of non-conforming residential where it's predominantly people of color, and we're going to put cultivation facilities with odor issues or what have you, we're going to compound that. So we recently, this is sort of just one minor response to an issue that we had with manufacturing and cultivators coming into. We only had a public hearing requirement for the retail operations because they're the only ones open to the public. And so we had a bunch of manufacturers and cultivators in a low-income community that had a residential zone right next to it. And so we had a whole community meeting where we had an opportunity for the operators, half of whom were most of them were equity applicants, so people could see, well, this is going to help some people that I want to support. But they also helped demystify what the cannabis business was going to be, because there are all sorts of rumors there's going to be explosions and this and that. And a lot of folks at the community meeting said this was helpful, but it would have been much better if we had this on the front end, because it felt like the deal's already been made and we just have a sour taste in our mouth because you did this before letting us know. So we've added a community meeting requirement for any cannabis use that's within a certain proximity of a residential zone. Haven't done that yet. We have a couple that are flagged to have those meetings, and so I'm hoping that's an opportunity. It doesn't solve some of these underlying land use issues, but maybe an opportunity to make people feel more respected and have their questions and concerns addressed before imposing this use next to them.
All right, great. Do we have any more questions?
Hi. Larissa, you made a comment a little bit ago that I really appreciated about all the ancillary businesses around this. And there are, when we're looking at trying to correct past inequities, there are a lot of programs that are out there that already try to do this, but so many of them tend to have a federal overlay, and that makes it difficult. However, that doesn't apply as long as you're not, your business isn't actually touching the cannabis itself. So I'm wondering, is some part of these social equity programs trying to find ways to engage these other resources that may already be there to help people find a foothold in this industry, even if it's not as a cultivator or a retailer or a manufacturer or whatever?
I can personally speak on behalf of nonprofits and not necessarily government agencies that are addressing this issue, but absolutely we're trying to show that there are other avenues that people can enter the cannabis space and to help train them in that aspect. But I do want to have these folks perhaps answer that to see if there's anything happening, on a government level.
We haven't started to engage that conversation just yet, and part of it is kind of similar. We have our hands full with trying to launch our licensing program, but I do think that that's the next phase of the conversation. It's our intention, because of the scale of our program, we will be hiring a social equity program coordinator so that individuals have a dedicated liaison, and I anticipate that this individual would also be responsible for connecting folks to these ancillary opportunities that may exist.
Excellent. And gentleman over here I saw had his hand up.
Has there been any thought of leveraging opportunity zone tax policy, particularly if there are chunks of money that are being raised that you guys are going to have access to? You're thinking about incubating one another, and thinking about using that money to leverage the outside networks or the outside marketplace to actually put in dollars to some of these businesses that you're talking about right now.
So I think I understand what you're asking. The city of Los Angeles has business improvement zones that I think kind of capture money that could go into the specific zoning. We don't have that program right now, but when Bia was asking the previous question of how do we make sure that there isn't this undue concentration, and how do we make sure that there's kind of impact mitigation in these areas that are going to be predominantly industrial, where we're going to have some of these activities, that was one of the thoughts that came to mind, is that if we are going to have kind of a block where there's a lot of cannabis activity happening, if this could be zoned and tax revenue can be generated and redistributed specifically to that zone where the activity is taking place, it would offset some of the impacts to the surrounding community. We're not doing that, but it is an idea.
All right, great. We have, yeah, one more. We can do one more.
Hi, Jeffrey from the City of Portland. So we just about a month ago implemented our social equity program, just got it launched. We did it quickly because we wanted to get something in the books and start this process, but we do need a lot more data coming up. And we have a market study coming up probably in the next few months or so, but in terms of your disparity or equity studies that you conducted, can you go over briefly what the timelines were, how long they took, any kind of roadblocks you hit as far as collecting information from other departments? We'll obviously have to go to police and try to pull records over a course of many, many years. And so if you have any tips or kind of obstacles you faced, that would be really helpful.
Ours went fairly smoothly and fairly quickly because we had this like multi-year debate that preceded this assignment of doing an analysis. So the analysis itself only took a couple months. And we also were lucky because we've had a cannabis commission for over a decade that annually evaluated police data, so it wasn't all that hard to collect. I think.
You have a Department of Race and Equity.
Well, until recently we didn't, but we have now it's a 2-person Department of Race and Equity. At the time it was a 1-person Department of Race and Equity, but obviously that changed. That was a game changer, and that's what helped move our process forward. But I believe Portland has a similar structure as well. I also, in some ways, I wouldn't overthink it. I mean, if you look at our analysis, San Francisco's, LA's, the barriers are going to be pretty similar, but there might be some nuances as well.
One of the things that I want to note when we were collecting data, and because the data will drive the program, being intentional about the data on the front end does matter. One of the nuances that we experienced when we were collecting data, specifically, we were trying to essentially map where all of the arrests were taking place throughout the city, and we were able to produce a heat map to see where most of those arrests were taking place. And part of the challenge is that what our program says right now is that if you lived in a disproportionately impacted community, that's one of the qualifiers for the program criteria. And when I was looking at the raw data, I was seeing that a lot of arrests were taking place near Beverly Hills and things. And I'm like, well, what's happening here? So we had to analyze not just where the arrest was taking place, but where the people lived, where the arrests were taking place. So it can be that, very small nuance, but if we would have created a social equity program where folks who lived in Beverly Hills would qualify because that was a disproportionately impacted area, the truth of the matter is there were probably Black and brown folks who were in Beverly Hills, and cops would find them, and they happen to find marijuana on them because they're in the city of Los Angeles, and that's one of the things that people in the city of Los Angeles will have on them. And so again, because the data will drive the program, it may make sense to kind of look at the raw data, take a step back and say, if we do this, does this actually benefit the folks that we intend to benefit?
And I would also, it also helps to look over a longer period of time. So some of those anomalies, 1 year in Beverly Hills has a bunch of arrests. Maybe over a 20-year period that might resolve itself.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for joining us on this luncheon. I want to have you guys join me in thanking the panelists.